So now you need leaders to defend yourself. How do you find leaders? Just like today. You don't find them, they find you. I still have friends that try to tell me they're in charge. I'll say it right to you. You need somebody like me to call you on your shit. Thank you. That's just what I felt was lacking in life, was a covertly hostile, marginal friend to supervise my behavior. Thanks. My friend winks hello when he sees me like that. We're grown men. He's like, what are you, the captain of the football team? I'm the freshman cheerleader. Oh, God, he noticed me. Like yourself. But back then, it's before language skills, but you knew who was going to run things because their posture told you where they were in evolution. These guys got their asses kicked by those guys, got the beat down by them guys, got knocked out by this guy because obviously he's in charge. He's standing there like that. Everybody else has the body language of a blogger.
I want to see these beautiful young ladies. I want to see them dancing when they're 4 years older, too.
Dynamite planted. Dynamite diffused.
What's good, dude? Good to hear from you.
Good to hear as well. I'm glad we both found the time to discuss this subject.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because me and you have been having a side conversation not pertaining to thoughts and doggies. We have talked a lot about the war in Syria. You're the only other person I can actually have a conversation with when it comes to the Middle East. And now we have the situation in Ukraine, which you know quite a bit about. Now, I don't. I'm pretty ignorant to it, other than some obvious mainstream, or I guess not so much mainstream, but alt news talking points when it comes to Ukraine. You know, naturally, it's easy to pick a side. Based Russia, Z, gotta go with Z, Putin, fighting global homo, etc., etc. But I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And
yeah,
I had mentioned to you that I cannot find good sources of references, good material, because everything is so biased, whether it's leaning towards the side of Russia or leaning to the side of the West. I don't necessarily have a good footing on the situation other than what I'm being told by you or by friends and, you know, other people that I listen to and follow. So, like I said, me and you have talked ad nauseum through phone calls and text messages or whatever, you know, just having a conversation about the situation. And I figured we'd do a chat about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you invited me on, and I hope to give some perspective as a Russian speaker and having family in both countries. I'm kind of shocked and kind of dismayed at what the narrative has been in the West, as many people have that have some knowledge of the issue. I'm glad to talk to you because you followed the Syrian war just as I did, like day to day. You know, some people follow sports and they like sports ball, but I think we followed the factions in Syria, the land they controlled, and the battles that took place, what happened politically. And in some ways, Ukraine is similar. In many ways, it's very different. But it is a modern war, and with modern coverage. So, and that's, I think, very useful that you have this background for you to kind of, even though you don't have the most intimate information, the most context, the most nuance, you can kind of decipher because you saw what happened in Syria. We both followed that war, and some similarities will pop up because, again, in the end, it's the same kind of factions in the background at each other's throat. So what I do want to give people is kind of an overview as how we got here from the earliest point in history we can track, because that context is not there. It doesn't exist. This has been over an 8-year civil war in Ukraine, and people are picking up this war to pay attention to it just as it happened on February 24th, which isn't true the case. February 24th, the Russian special operation, and why I call it special operation, if it was a war, every Ukrainian city would be in rubble. every Ukrainian city would be destroyed. So it is a limited operation. So that's what the point of view of the show is, to give context as to how this occurred, and not to start just where a lot of the media is paying attention to, a lot of the observers that are new to this are paying attention to. It's to go back and talk about how we came to this moment in history. So how I want to introduce this is kind of a big problem we have is, like, right now we're in the West and outsiders lacking the proper context to a foreign situation. And I believe this is a repeat of history, because this has happened before in, within the Russian Empire. Is when there was the Bolshevik Revolution, the Western powers greatly wanted to reduce the chance of, like, Russian Napoleon coming out of the crisis to threaten Europe and that power block. So they kind of made the mistake of giving too much support to the Bolsheviks. Germany moving a major figure like Lenin over there, and the British bombing the White Fleet in multiple, there was many other instances. There was many nations from the West that put troops on the ground. The United States had a lot of troops on the ground that eventually retreated and fought with the Red Army. So there has been Western intervention that has led to a certain path in history, and it's kind of, in some ways, history does repeat. So when we talk about Ukraine from the origination, it comes from the word krai. So krai in Russian means edge, because Ukraine is essentially a borderland. And both societies bordering west and east of Ukraine called it this. The Polish called it a borderland, since it was on the eastern edges of Poland, and the Russians did too, because it's on the western edge of the Russian Empire. And this land was ruled by many societies. You had the Romans, Ottomans, you had the Polish, Russians, and many others. And by the early Middle Ages, it was held by Russia, but then it was conquered in the Middle Ages by Poland, and Poland installed a feudal system. Ukraine had a lot of farms and plantations, and these were manned by Orthodox Russians, and they would end up being ruled by a Polish Catholic elite, Jews, and Western Ukrainians. Cossacks also lived in Ukraine. And who are the Cossacks? Cossacks are basically Russian people who live wherever the borders of the Russian Empire are. So when the Russian Empire existed, also the eastern part of Russia, like in past Siberia, the easternmost fringes, they were also called a Ukraine, because it is a borderland. So when Poles had controlled this territory in Middle Ages, they escalated a conflict by starting confiscation of land from southern Russian peasants and the Cossacks. They kicked out Russian landowners. There was really a lot of religious tension, because Polish were Catholics, and they wanted to convert a lot of Russians to Catholicism. So Russians were Eastern Orthodox. And the 17th centuries by the 17th century, we see multiple uprisings. The first was the Zaporizhian Cossacks, who were not initially supported directly by the Russian Empire, but eventually were, and they rose against the Polish landowners. So this eventually led to a war between Russia and Poland that lasted for more than a decade. It eventually resulted in a Russian victory, which gained these lands back, and that basically was Russia getting those lands back after like 300, 400 years. So in this context, what Ukraine becomes is Little Russia, Mala Rossiya. So Ukraine, in context as Russia as a whole, why it's called Little Russia, this comes from way back in history, when Little Greece was like the actual Greece, and then you had the Big Greece, Magna Graecia, which was the southern Italy holdings of the Greek Empire. And modern Ukraine had a lot of territories that does not have a connection to this history. such as Novorossiya, which was the steppes above northern Ukraine of Crimea, which had no settlements. In the 18th century, this area was built up by the Russian Empire. They built cities, settlements from up the and moved a ton of settlers into that location, which was didn't have any static populations at that time. And then you have Galatia, which is western Ukraine, which was really separate from the Russian world. It was ruled by Austrians, Germans, Polish, Hungarians. The Galatian dialect, which is in western Ukraine, is closer to Polish than it is closer to anything Russian. And then Ukraine was not a separate nation from Russia. There was a Malo-Russian identity, that small Russia identity, but it's just like the Saxons and Bavarians in Germany. The Saxons could say, hey, we're Saxons. The Bavarians could say, we're Bavarians. But in the end, they're both German. And it's really, you see this kind of differentiation in history a lot of times. Southern people versus northern people. I mean, we have that in the United States. And this was kind of that aspect. And then in the 19th century, you have the start of the project of Ukraine. So Romanticism was an idea coming from Europe into Russia. It was German idealism, where the peasants are the true nation, regional identities are really emphasized. And then all these Russian intellectuals that came in contact with this became writing literature in a dialect of local peasants called Surzhyk. It's a rural Russian dialect. What it really means, it's a mix of languages, but it really originates with Russian. You can call it like a Russian peasant language. And then the Russian Empire itself, the core, did not see this as a threat. But to the West, the Austrians saw this as an opportunity to promote separatism in the Russian Empire, which was one of its enemies. Ukrainian nationalism came about in the late 19th century. It was spearheaded by urban intellectuals. It wasn't really embraced by the Malo-Russian peasants that, was the inhabitants of what we know as Ukraine. And then modern Ukrainian nationalism, as we know it today in 2022, it doesn't have anything in common what we'll talk about right now in the kind of the history of the 19th century, where it originates. So an initial Ukraine movement was supported by Austria, and the goal was there to make Russian weak. In World War I, Austrians made this a focus. Ukraine was headed by primarily Poles and Jews, like the Ukrainian national movement, because these two groups had really a lot of grievances with the Russian Empire. Particularly the Jewish population was much larger in Ukraine than in Russia. And then pro-Ukrainian demonstrations that took place during this time had like a lot of Austrian flags in Kiev that were waving around. So you can tell back then the Austrian influence. So after that, we have World War I and the Russian Revolution, which was a chaotic period. In late 1917, there was a Ukrainian People's Republic proclaimed out of the chaos, and there was a coup later by Getman Saradvatsky. He's a Russian general supported by Austria and Germany. He creates basically the Ukrainian state. At the same time, there was a political movement called Ukrainianism. It was started by Simon Petruia. And Petruia, he rose up against Skoropadsky, the general, and overthrew him. And then at the same time, you have the Galatians. The Western Ukrainian had actually a pro-Russian stance at that time due to Austrians being kind of harsh towards their Eastern Slavic populations that they had under their control. The Austrians were concerned of a pro-Russian uprising in Galatia and set up one of the first concentration camps, and they did a lot of purges of pro-Russian figures. They claimed spies, so they totally cleansed the area. The further Western Ukrainians today, it's by popular belief on both sides, they'll say it's an east-west split. Well, not exactly. If you look at the Western Ukrainians today, kind of the modern Galatian population, they have one of the lowest volunteer rates to go to fight in the Donbass Wars that started in 2014. And they're actually some of the first populations now to protest mobilization. Right now, Ukraine's on its going to be going on its sixth wave of mobilization this current war. And the first footage that comes out of civilians kind of protesting this, hey, don't send our guys over there, came from these western areas, kind of close to the more Hungarian populations. And going back to World War One and kind of the Russian Revolution that's going on, there's a Russian Civil War that ensues. There's the Bolsheviks with the red side, communist, and there's the monarchist, the white side. And the white monarchist in Ukraine, they're called like the Southern Russian Forces. They had basically an army of 3,000 march on Kiev, the White Guard, and they took the city from 20,000 Ukrainian troops without much of a fight. Ukrainians weren't really entrenched and invested in any ideals at that time, and the White Russians were fighting kind of for their nation at that time. They had a lot at stake. And the guy in charge of this feat was General Bogatov, and he stated that Kiev was never Ukrainian and never will be. And then the only military in Ukraine the White Russians allied with was the Ukrainian Galatian army in the western Ukraine, and they would fight any Ukrainian separatist forces that they came across. All the separatist forces, including the White Russians, they all failed. Their figures died and became irrelevant. And the Soviet Union, the Soviet Ukraine came about. And what happened in the Soviet Union is the Soviet main objective was to have an ethnic policy of disenfranchising the majority Russian population. The Russian population was seen as privileged and imperious and colonialist. And communists, what they wanted to do is they wanted to destroy the Russian heartland and divide the Russian ethnicity as a concept, since it was a very large group, a threat to kind of like a new ideology taking hold. You can have a lot of ethnic centrism, which you can spike a counter-revolution. And so to weaken the Russian imperialist, lots of the Soviet Union territory was given to minorities within the Russian Empire. These policies were called Koreanization. And then which stated that government should be headed by local populations. Like Russian shouldn't be taught in school. It should be whatever the area, whatever the republic, which were basically ethnic republics, even though you had like Karelia, which was 90% Russian, but they had tried to make it headed by minorities. So at this time, what was going on in Ukraine was Ukrainization, basically the process of turning the Malo-Russians, the small Russians, and Nova-Russians into Ukrainians. Which was like populations, basically a part of Russians, which were just on the periphery, were now being put into a whole different category under the Soviet system. And you had even Lenin, and he gave away from Donbass to Odessa, and he put that jurisdiction under the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So that meant that tens of millions of peasants who didn't know that they were Ukrainian, didn't know Ukrainian language, all of a sudden became Ukrainian under the Soviet ideology. And the Ukrainian language was really constructed by Soviets in the 1920s and 1930s. It was kind of made up by the Soviet regime. It had little relations to Galatian language. The 19th century Romantics we talked about, where a bunch of urban elite tried to make their own kind of Ukrainian language, and Suzak languages, which was a peasant Russian. And this Soviet system was enforced by Soviet passports. Soviet passports, if you open it, you look at it, it has your ethnicity in it in the earlier times. So it had identity politics. It definitely had identity politics you see today. And then a big event is Holodomor, and why Holodomor is so important, so stated to Ukraine. Holodomor is to modern Ukraine what the Holocaust is to Israel. It's the foundational myth of a huge crime and justice that gives you the moral basis for our nation state. However, Holodomor is really misinterpreted as to what really occurred. Holodomor was a policy of starvation to break the wool of the peasants not working under the Soviet rule. the government of the time of Ukraine, at the time of Holodomor, was 70% Ukrainians, 20% Jews, 10% Georgians, Lithuanians, and Poles. And then it wasn't an ethnic policy. It was enacted by Ukrainians basically at the time against Ukrainians and Russians. It can't be called a genocide because it wasn't targeted towards a specific population. Russian peasants actually suffered the most by the numbers. They were the most numerous in the area, and Ukraine was the most farm region of the Soviet Union, had the right soil, had the most farmers, basically the heartland of wheat and everything. So, and Holodomor was a good cover for the de-Russification that was going on in the process of Ukraine. So what actually happened is Southern Russian peasant culture, which was just core to Russia itself, was taken and spun as actual Ukrainian culture that was kind of made up by the Soviets. If for evidence, I mean, you can't find like classic Ukrainian literature. You can't find any literature at all until the 1960s. The only Ukrainian literature was technical documentation, and then there's party propaganda for the Soviets. And Russian continued to be used in all forms of life. The language was really not picked up by the population of Ukraine because, again, it was a false invention. And language is supposed to convey ideas, and this language wasn't suited to that because it was just virtue signaling on the behalf of the Soviet regime. So it was constantly changed. Rules were constantly inputted. So it wasn't really picked up. Even today, the official statistics only show that, up to 30% of Ukrainians speak Ukrainian at the home. And then those surveys can be really manipulated since 2014. The Ukrainian government has had a anti-Russian stance on language, and everyone has to learn Ukrainian, only use Ukrainian. But if you look at app usage within Ukraine, which is going to be more unbiased, it's over 90% Russian when it comes to the apps. The first president of Ukraine post-Maidan, Petro Poroshenko, he had a speech even, and he gave it, and he was trying to convey it in Ukrainian, but nobody really knows Ukrainian 100%. So he actually had to apologize, and he stated that, oh, well, I need to learn my native language. And it's like, how can you say that when that is clearly not your native language? So you have these type of really silly games going on. There were some Ukrainian modern day nationalists. They look at Duolingo. They look at the stats and they show for a time there was more. It was number 2, number 3 language, and Russia was way below it, and they were basically proud of this. But really what it was is the Ukrainian population, scared of repression that would take place past 2014, trying to learn this language that kind of never really existed as the majority language of that area. So back to the Soviet Union. What was occurring in the Soviet Union is Ukrainians were the only Russians now that were allowed to be in the elite class. 3 of the 7 Soviet leaders were Ukrainian. Ukrainians basically become the staple of the Soviet government. Russians weren't allowed into elites. Ukrainians, since they're a new creation by the Soviet Union feels that these are actually going to be your most loyalist peoples, because without the Soviet state, this would not have been such a population. And so eventually what happens is Ukrainian nationalism is just infused in the Soviet regime until World War II, which causes a problem with the Western Galatian Ukrainians, which was only annexed in the Soviet Union in 1939, two years before the war happened between the Axis and the Soviet Union. And so there was always an underground nationalist movement in the area, but they came to sprout when the Axis started invading the Soviet Union. One of these is the UPA. They're an anarchist movement within Ukraine. They fought both the Soviets and the Germans. And then you have the German allied, the Axis allied Ukrainian Nationalist, the ones kind of the most hardcore. The part of the reason why they allied with the Axis is because they had a lot of connections back when the Austrians were in that area. A lot of them served in the Austrian military, so they had nostalgia, some of them, for that. So you had like units like the SS Galatia unit. It was very notorious. And then eventually the UPA and the Axis movement were destroyed by the Soviets in the World War II. But and this is where the Ukrainian like neo-Nazism you see kind of in modern times comes from. It's exclusively Galatian. Basically, the rest of Ukraine fought with the Red Army. And after the Axis were defeated, the Carpathian region of Galatia, rebels were active in that area against the Soviet Union till about the mid-50s. So there was an actual war there. The Soviet, and then fast forwarding to when the Soviet Union collapses, there was a referendum in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, and unanimously almost, less support as you get to the east, but in every region winning is, and this kind of came when the Soviet Union already fell apart, so it was really just a gesture. It was, they voted to, again, secede from the Soviet Union, become their own nation. And the big idea was this, is not to secede against Russia. It's not to go against Russia. The idea was at that time, hey, we're not in the Soviet Union anymore, but we're brotherly nations. It was a more economic, it was an economic pursuit because Ukraine, they got from the Soviet Union, they inherited a lot of factories, heavy industry, their agriculture, their access to the Black Sea, that sea is Azov. So they thought they were in a very good position. They can really ascend. We have basically the Soviet Union falling apart, and in regards to population, in the late 1980s, Ukraine reaches 50 million, peaking at about over 52 million at the end of the Soviet Union in 1992. And then Ukraine, at that point, had kind of become as a true project of de-Russification, with a lot of Western-aligned leaders that wanted to get closer to the West and had an anti-Russian view. They started cherry-picking history from Russia's history, Polish history, Turkish history, to kind of reclaim that history as themselves, picking out the good stuff, and to say, what do we look like as a Ukrainian state? Let's pick and choose the history we want to present, and this is not the whole of Ukraine. This is the Western aligned factions. So the appearance, the genes, the culture of Russians and Ukrainians is shared. The populations of Russia and Ukraine are very intermixed. The largest minority in Ukraine are Russians. The largest minority in Russia are Ukrainians. And you'll have almost so many Russians have relatives in Ukraine. You have a lot of Ukrainians with relatives in Russia. So they're they're really one nation. And what Ukraine really is at that point is it's really a political movement. And that political movement gets a lot of steam because Ukraine is left with a lot of heavy industry and nuclear weapons. It's in a pretty good position. And at the same time, Russia is, it's fallen through the 90s. It's disintegrating. You have separatism alive. You have Yeltsin, which is really incompetent, drunk in public. He basically signed multiple accords, which basically said that the Soviet Union was completely didn't exist anymore. And despite kind of like the brotherly ties between Ukrainians and Russians, Poland and the United States, they both jumped on the opportunity to make Ukraine an anti-Russian state. And so Ukraine, if you look at a lot of maps, with exception to like the Galatian nuance we discussed earlier, you see east and west divides, like as to the politicians, the east and west Ukraine, the Russian-speaking population, the ethnic Russians. There's an east-west divide that's becomes clear depending on which political maps you used. And so, in result of this, Ukraine had a lot of political feuds. Western presidents would come into power, promising to basically wrestle resources from the East and put them to the West. Then the East would have their own parties and representatives and presidents that would state to their supporters, hey, we're going to take the West Ukrainians' resources and assign them or put them to the East. And again, this also goes back to the religious issue, because Western Ukraine, as you get closer to Galatia, they want to be close to the Catholic countries of Eastern Europe, while the Eastern Ukraine, again, wants to be closer to Russia due to that Orthodox connection. And then what you have as a result of this, you don't have unity. You have a lot of nepotism in the leadership. You have a lot of corruption. You have a lot of economic gambles. And then this all boils up to a point. In 2004, we have the Western-backed Orange Revolution. And this was really just a result of the instability in the country. At that point, the EU was rapidly advancing east. The EU Economic Union. Estonia had joined in that year. And at that time, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the EU seemed very economically attractive. This is due to wages, the pension, the unrestricted travel. Once you are part of the EU, you can go to anywhere in Europe unrestricted. And then Russia didn't have much to offer in comparison. Russia's kind of going through a collapse. So it makes sense that economically Ukraine wants to distance itself from that. And certain political factions in Ukraine start making their number one priority to be integrated within the EU. And so in 2004, in the midst of this Orange Revolution, there was a challenging election. Viktor Yushchenko, and he's kind of Western Ukraine aligned, pro-EU, versus Viktor Yanukovych of the Eastern Ukraine. If you look at the electoral map, he gets kind of a lot of the Eastern vote. So Viktor Yanukovych won in the first round, and then there was a recount and a second recount, and then eventually Yushchenko, he won in the second rerun. And then in 2010, Yushchenko only has one term. In 2010, there's another election in Ukraine, and Viktor Yanukovych, aligned more to the east, parties of region, that's the party he comes from, he wins the election. And there's a lot of claims in the West and in some parts of Ukraine that he's a Russian puppet, which is just objectively not true, because he plays a lot of games with the Russians. He extorts Russia over gas deals, which leads to Russia having really unfavorable gas. So when the Soviet Union was around, the only way Russian gas passed, or Soviet gas passed through Europe and was exchanged for money, was through Ukraine. There was no Nord Stream, Yamal, all those pipelines. And now that there was no longer Soviet Union, Ukraine gained a lot of its state revenue by basically getting a tax. So Russia would sell the gas through Ukraine, and Ukraine just not doing anything really besides having those Soviet gas infrastructure on its territory, would just gain a rent from it. So, and Yanukovych, he played kind of both sides, the pro-EU West side and the Russian side. And at this point, the EU, and we can see now, is in reality, EU is really not good for the Eastern European nations. You have like 25% of Latvia's population are guest workers. And why is that a bad situation? Is because you have brain drain. And brain drain is just devastating. It takes away your youthful working population. So the Eastern European countries, they educate, they raise, they culture, they do all the hard work of raising a worker, for that worker just to be shipped off to, the West, Western Europe, and just to work there. It's basically the West Europe did not have to spend its tax revenue, its efforts, and its education into creating this worker. So it's complete it's demographic thievery of doing this. It's a good strategy for Western Europe that has doesn't have favorable demographics, but it's devastating towards Eastern Europe that doesn't have good demographics either. So you have rapid depopulation in Eastern EU countries. It's not a good situation it's a good situation for the Western countries, not a good situation for the East. Just the brain drain argument basically proves that case. So when the Orange Revolution didn't end up achieving much because the Eastern aligned president, or he so thought to be, Yanukovych, still won the 2010 election. So then came the Maidan Revolution. And what really sparked the Maidan Revolution is, of course, a lot of Western influence, a lot of Western preparation of groups, fringe groups, far-right groups, pro-EU groups. So Yanukovych, he did not sign the association agreement with the EU. And this agreement is it's just symbolic, really, because this agreement has been signed by Georgia, a lot of North African countries, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, Tunisia. And these countries have been in these association agreements for decades, and nothing really happens with these countries. They don't get integrated into EU, they don't get the pension, they don't get the wages, they don't get on any of these benefits. It's just a kind of an empty promise. And so pro-EU Maidan supporters that were really upset about this, they have always been misled, and I don't believe they're really pro-Ukrainian. What they really want to do is get to the EU as fast as possible. They want access, they want the cosmopolitan life, they want the access to the higher wages, and they want to, basically leave Ukraine as much as possible. They're not for a strong Ukraine. But they're also misled because they would get this association agreement and nothing would really happen. And what you saw during the Maidan protests, you saw a lot of Western influence come about. A lot of, you had Victoria Nuland. She was on the ground, like, handing out cookies. She had a leaked phone call, which she said, fuck the EU. Basically, saying that U.S. wants, U.S. policy reigns supreme. The EU has no say, just a vassal of us. You had John McCain meet with, the right sector, which was a far-right Russophobic group. You had George Soros sponsoring a lot of these pro-democracy, quote-unquote, groups in the streets. And so eventually a lot of these pro-Western, anti-Russian groups, a lot of them used to be football hooligan groups that were basically made into militias that trained on how to riot. Like Antifa-like groups, really. And Antifa was there, too. Antifa's on the side of these even pro-Nazi groups because Antifa people, even from Russia, come over to riot in favor of the Maidan protest. So street battles ensued. I mean, everyone's seen it. The right sector, which was a hard Russophobic group, eventually mobilized, was kind of the spearhead. And there was a lot of weird events where there were snipers that were killing both police officers and protesters, kind of to ignite the protests, which, again, doesn't make too much sense. And there was pictures released of a lot of protesters having, firearms while the police didn't have any. And then at the same time, you have Crimea, and they're looking at this, they're looking at the kind of the chaos, and they don't want a part of this. And even in the 90s, they've always shown that they wanted to. They're almost a full Russian population over there, and they've always wanted to go back to Russia. And even if it's not a patriotic or ethnic argument, it's an economic argument. As soon as Crimea became part of Russia, salaries for teachers and doctors tripled because there's a higher standard of pay within Russia than Ukraine. So, and you saw in 2014 finally the Russian military act, and there was a lot of troops, tens of thousands of troops stationed in Crimea already, because there was a lease agreement till the 2070s or 2060s on the port. And you had basically a referendum come, you had Russian military secure the whole area as well. And this was a bloodless process. It was a very successful operation because only one or two people died, one of them just being a Ukrainian soldier in some altercation. So it was for taking a territory of almost 3 million people, it was a very bloodless population. And other people in eastern Ukraine that were Russian themselves, considered them Russian, wanted to be part of Russia, they saw this as like, hey, we could do this. Not only is it bloodless, Russia can come support us, we can do it. It doesn't have to be violent. And so they started uprising. They started taking over government buildings. They started pushing the Kiev regime out of city centers, government buildings. It happened mainly in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kharkiv, and in Odessa. So that's where they were basically the old borders of Malo and Novorossiya. And so this eventually came to an end in Odessa in early May of 2014 when 40 Russian protesters who were inside of government building were basically burned to death because the building was set on fire and they were trapped inside by counter protesters and these Ukrainian these basically political groups that went around and they suppressed a lot of them were armed militias and they suppressed Russian separatism. And so the hope of Russians in Ukraine was really to fight against a Russophobic regime that, again, immediately when they came into power, they started passing anti-Russian language laws. You're not allowed to learn Russian in schools. There's tons of literature and official bills on this. And so from here we move on to the Donbass Wars, which a lot of people, again, what I talked about at the start, is they say they only pay attention to this whole from the start of February 24, like, oh look, Russia invaded Ukraine, and they don't have the context. They don't even realize that this is an ongoing civil war, and Russia's intervening in the civil war. This is the technicality. And so what happened is when political solutions did not work in Donbass, there was people who were wanting to take up arms. They wanted to finally secede from Ukraine. And this would not have been possible without, basically, what's interesting in history, sometimes one person makes the whole difference. And this was a man called Igor Strzelkov, and he was employed by the FSB in Crimea. And he had basically a desk job, and his job was to investigate terrorists. You had the Crimean Tatars that were potentially going to try to do terrorism. There were starts of blowing up bridges, assassinations, car bombs, all this. So that's what his job was. That he was a veteran of the Chechen Wars. He was really into LARPing. There's pictures of him in LARPing from Napoleon War reenactments, Russian Civil War reenactments, and such. So what he did at the time of the Maidan Revolution and everything going on in Crimea is he knew his superiors would call him not to act. Russia initially did not support the separatism of the Donbass republics, the Donetsk People's Republics and Lugansk People's Republics. So what he did is he closed his laptop, turned off his phone in order to basically give the excuse, so I didn't receive any commands. And this is all presented in a book that recently got translated by English by Peter Nemitz. It's called Slaviansk in 85 Days in Slaviansk. Basically talks about the start of the civil war in eastern Ukraine. And so Igor Strzelkov, he went into Ukraine, he actually wasn't allowed to do that. And he collected 56 men around in Donetsk. He formed his first militia, and he went to the western kind of edge of the Donbass territory, the Donetsk People's Republics, in Slaviansk, which is a city about 150,000. It's kind of a Soviet-built city, industry city. Got the block buildings, the factories, and he did an uprising there. He had, again, started with 56 men. By the end, in that city, he had 1,000, and he had like 6 APCs, like couple mortars, almost nothing. And what was facing him was a force of by the end 30,000 Ukrainian troops that were basically under the new Kiev regime, and they were, a lot of them, ordered to, you know, stomp out all separatism, which was funny because their revolution was fine in Kiev, but other people trying to separate was not okay. And so that's the Donbass Wars. Is Slavyansk is the start. You have a lot of success there from Strzelkov. His troops are able to down like dozens of Ukrainian helicopters, destroy dozens of Ukrainian tanks. Again, at this time, the Ukrainian army is in disarray. A lot of the Ukrainian army, you can go see Vice News. Vice News has footage, and they eventually become an anti-Russian after this war source. But in these videos, if you see early Ukraine, you see a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. Where the bulk of the Donbass rebels came from is actually the Ukrainian army. They were National Guard units. They didn't want to fight their own populations. So a lot of them hand over their weapons. A lot of the military commands switch sides. A lot of the former federal police officers, like the Berkut forces that were in Kiev that suffered under the Maidan, they go over to the east, and they form militias. You have coal miner militias in Donetsk form. A lot of volunteers from Russia pour in. And people say, well, this is all Russian supported, it's staffed by Russian soldiers. That's not the case. So this whole thing is not a monolith of Russia, because Igor Strzelkov is an anti-Kremlin figure. He's a big skeptic. Even today, he is. He's basically a kind of a thorn, because he provides like a revolutionary spirit that's different to the agendas and wants of the Kremlin. They don't exactly want a hot war on their border at that time. So, yeah, so it's kind of one of the first militaries or armies funded by payments from just civilians, sending PayPal payments to buy like night vision goggles, all sorts of equipment, all these donation pages, and volunteers coming to the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So what these entities are fighting for is basically something to preserve the Russian identity within Ukraine. They don't agree with the Maidan revolution. They don't want to get close to the West. And because of this, they're severely punished. Full-out war breaks out. You had basically an Israeli-Ukrainian billionaire, Kolomoisky. He funded 2 battalions, 8R1, 8R2, which eventually swelled up to like 10 to 20,000 people. And they're one of the first to receive like Israeli bullpup rifles and all this equipment from the West. And they go in and they start kind of an ethnic cleansing campaign, along with Azov, along with other more radical units that integrate themselves within the Ukrainian military, like Battalion Donbass, Adar. You have Tornado Battalion, which is a battalion made of actual like criminals, murderers, pedophiles, all that were released in order to go fight. To fight back the pro-Russian forces, the separatist forces. So the war really goes between 2014 2015. There's like Slavyansk is eventually the Igor Strzelkov. He eventually is pushed out of the city. He's overwhelmed. He only have 1,000 men. So he's pushed, and as of today, Ukrainians still hold that territory. They did an offensive, pushing the rebels all the way to the west suburbs of Donetsk. So between 2014 and 2015, the insurgents, the in Donetsk, they fight a desperate battle, but start taking significant victories. If you look at like the earlier armor counts, for every one separatist vehicle, which is really just a Ukrainian vehicle that came over to the side of Russia, and again, there's video footage of like Vice News, Ukrainian soldiers surrendering equipment, vehicles themselves, turning sides. It was like 10 Ukrainian vehicles, tanks, APCs were destroyed against because the Ukrainian army was fighting a war they're not really committed to, and a really entrenched insurgency, an army that had a lot of people that served in Afghanistan and Chechnya that knew Soviet military tactics. You had a lot of older guys, 30 years old, 40 years old, take up arms. You had a lot of volunteers come from all over the world. And when you look at the composition of volunteers, it's very interesting. Like, you had a lot of Volga Germans, and on the side, more Germans were on the side of the Donbass People's Republics. And you had, French volunteers, Spanish volunteers, a lot of Croatian volunteers for the Ukrainians, a lot of Serbian volunteers for the pro-Russian side. A lot of Americans split. You had like a Texan that was like a communist guy. You had like a guy from Colombia. You have a lot. It's in a ways it's a lot like the Spanish Civil War. You have volunteers from all sides coming in. And so some of the key battles is the Donetsk Airport. Donetsk Airport, the first battle, the rebels, they try to hold it, but they're quickly dispatched by attack helicopters and special forces that are sent in with the Ukrainian VDV that hold down the airport. Eventually, this turns into the second. This battle is kind of the most emblematic. This is the most footage you see, because the airport eventually, it was a really modernized airport, expensive one. Probably one of the most modernized in Ukraine. It was completely destroyed, all its terminals and everything, and that's where like the real pitched battles were fought. That's where like the Ukrainians had the mythos of the cyborgs, which were just like these Ukrainian holdouts, and eventually both sides suffer about 800 casualties on each side, and the rebels are able to take the airport in the second battle of Donetsk Airport and route the Ukrainians out of there. One of the commanders, he was famous, Motorola, he basically gave the Ukrainians a green corridor out of there. So because there's still a lot of it is Ukrainians against Ukrainians, really, when it comes to citizenry, there's still, and even Ukrainians versus Russians, there's still a brotherly agreement. So it's not a war total destruction. There is sometimes these green corridors and that happened. And you also have a battle take place, which is at that time becomes the largest tank battle in all of since World War II. And again, the Ukrainians, if you look at the video and photo evidence, prove the armor losses, vehicle losses. It's like 10-1. It's a pretty big embarrassment for Ukraine. It's a total disarray. A lot of people don't want to fight. They don't see any point. I mean, look at kind of the spirit of it. If you're in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, you're fighting to separate. You're fighting for your own nations, while the people coming at you are supporting some, coup d'etat that happened, some, illegitimate regime that, they can separate from. They can, have their revolution, but the East can't. So all this, basically, you have the Minsk I agreement, doesn't work out. It was an agreement to try to have a cessation of the hostilities. And then you have Minsk II come around, but at the same time, you have kind of the final battle of the Donbass theater. And this was a town called Debastavo, and it's kind of like a crossroads in the Donetsk People's Republics. It's a very strategic point. And what happened is the Ukrainians got encircled there. A lot of their armor, a lot of their units, they found themselves encircled. And what the president at the time, he really tried to push as many troops onto the east, try to take it back in one swift, and really underestimated the rebellion and how tenacious they were. And there was a legitimate encirclement, and at that point, the insurgency part of the first Donbass War, I'd say, was lost by Ukrainians, is when that encirclement happened. And again, I think early 2015, and then Minsk 2 came around. And what happened is there was kind of a between then and 2022 is a complete ceasefire, sorta. What happens on the Ukrainian side is there's a lot of hard anti-Russophobe forces. You have the Azov Battalion, and Azov Battalion rolled into Mariupol, which was a very pro-Russian town, and there's a British journalist there at the time, and there's footage that a lot of the Ukrainian military is just straight up firing on unarmed civilians that are trying to protest, trying to do a referendum there. And Mariupol was definitely a pro-Russian city, except that the the Kremlin told the Donbass, the Donetsk People's Republic's forces to leave Mariupol. Again, so the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic and the Kremlin, the Russian leadership, are not ideologically aligned. There is friction there. It's not a monolith. There's different ideas or different wants. There's a lot of like you have Givi and Motorola, these guys that become really big figures. Givi is a guy that's famous for, like, he kind of does the cool guys don't look at the explosions. He's famous in a lot of the footage. He's on the Vice News. He's on filmed where, you know, shells are falling and he doesn't care. He just smokes a cigarette. He gives that like badass kind of rebel. He has that image. Unfortunately, a lot of these figures die. You know, the Ukrainians take responsibility for it, but it is basically, there's conspiracy theories that the Kremlin did it to kind of get rid of war figures. Again, that's very skeptical. Maybe most likely it is Ukrainians that did that. And there's all other things that both sides, there is evidence that there was Russian official troops, whether they did it on orders or off on the territory of Donbass, and more like a observer role, and even more than that. And then there was evidence, there's pictures circulated of either former or contractors of former U.S. military, you know, captured. You know, when you see pictures of, you know, even if the person's wearing a Ukrainian uniform but they're African American, you clearly know they don't really belong in that theater. So you have all these kind of, but obviously it's kind of like Syria in that it becomes a proxy war between Russia and NATO. And since Ukrainians' defeat in 2015 in Minsk 2, they basically go back to the drawing board. A new president gets elected. That same oligarch that has Israeli ties, Kolomoisky, he funds a Ukrainian comedian, which is a Russian-speaking guy, which is Volodymyr Zelensky, that everybody knows. And he is put on a TV show called Servant of the People, where he accidentally becomes president. So basically a preparation for this guy to actually become president eventually. And this guy becomes kind of like the project to, he runs a campaign. He says, you know, we're going to solve the Donbass crisis peacefully. And then he's elected, and all that goes out the window. What's very interesting is there's video of this guy going to the front lines, and when he's trying to tell like a sergeant from Azov Battalion to, hey, you're going to put your weapons down, you're going to go home, like where are the weapons, take down the weapons. That sergeant actually talks back to him and says, you know, we're not doing that. Like, you have really no power here. There's video of this. And it's kind of shocking, because if you had like the U.S. president go to, like, you know, someplace and tell a sergeant to, you know, that's very, it just shows you the power a group like Azov, this group that is completely, its main objective is to, you know, destroy Russian populations, of how powerful they are within Ukraine. they are entrenched in the political system of Ukraine to even challenge the president. And so at that point, every year since 2014, about 3 brigades, I believe, of Ukrainian military is being trained by NATO trainers in like Poland. It's participating in NATO exercises. So about 3 brigades, I believe, a year are trained. So tens of thousands of troops. What happens is the Ukrainians form this thing called the Ato Anti-Terrorist Operation, and that's where a lot of the shelling comes from. There was basically a genocidal effort to bombard the Donbass as much as possible. If you look at casualties tracked by the UN in like the last 5 years, almost like 82% of casualties were occurred on the breakaway region side. So it was Ukrainian military shelling those areas, and they did that, time to time, destroying buildings, destroying whatever. There's a lot of footage of just airstrikes happening in city centers. So this area, even though they couldn't win it, they wanted to, basically say, you're not going to live peacefully. The continuous shelling, a lot of issues. So, and that's kind of as to the invasion, the Russian intervention, the official Russian intervention that came. As to, there is some talk that the Ukrainians were preparing a Donbass offensive to take back Donetsk and Lugansk. There is good evidence for that. What happened, and I guess I want to kind of give you the mic, because I've covered kind of the basics leading up to this, and I'll give myself a break. And with the initial invasion and what you've seen, what are your thoughts as to where we're at now, Lamprey, with the war that's ongoing in Ukraine?
Listen, that was an amazing synopsis and dissertation on the situation in Ukraine. I really appreciate that. It's really nice to hear some clarity on Ukraine and a little bit of the backstory, truncating it for our listeners. Like I said, I know very little about Slavic history. It's not my thing. I did follow what had transpired in 2014. I find it strange that from fall of the Soviet Union to 2014, 2015, we never heard anything out of Ukraine. The little I know about Ukraine, it's the second poorest country in Europe. You kind of glanced over the brain drain, mass immigration. I actually have some statistics here for our listeners. There are only 21 million Ukrainians between the ages of 20 and 55, which suggests that more than 2/5 of prime working age Ukrainians earn their living elsewhere. And this has been ongoing, I guess, the past 30 years. They are also in a kind of a strange phase as far as their birth rate. It is below it's 1.2 children per female, and one of the world's highest rates out of migration. No other country has willed itself out of existence so decisively as the Ukrainians have done. So you mentioning the part about why so many Ukrainians would be on board for joining the EU, this kind of reinforces that so many people are trying to leave that country. I find it also telling that OnlyFans is rallying behind Ukraine because, so many of their women have OnlyFans accounts, kind of bringing that whole female dichotomy situation between men and women. You hear about prostitution, hear about sex trafficking. It's also one of the most corrupt countries. Funny thing is that their neighbor is the most impoverished country, which is Moldova, which does not have much of a Ukrainian population. It is predominantly Romanian and Russian. I'd like to know why we're not hearing so much from Moldova, because from what I understand, Russia does have a presence in that country. And if we look at some of these maps, it seems that Russia has put forces on the Moldovan-Ukrainian border. Do you know anything about that before I kind of keep on talking?
Yeah, the Transnistria is basically a breakaway part of Moldova, which is again a Russian-speaking Russian population, and there is a contingent of 2,000 to 3,000 Russian troops, but they're really set up for defense. And this was against like a '90s endeavor. No war there, no nothing. Moldova is not part of NATO, and I don't believe part of the EU. I may be wrong in that, but yeah, Moldova, not a lot of.
Well, it does have female politicians. One of them, it does have two female. There's a female prime minister and a female president, and I think that they are both part of the banking class for the what is it? Not WTO. What's the World Bank? Sorry.
Oh, IMF.
And yeah, IMF. Thank you. I did a show with Tim Kelly, I think 2 months ago, where I was glancing over a little bit about Moldova and all the world, basically European politicians and their connections and how they came up through the managerial class. So yeah, I saw that on the map. I find that to be quite interesting because that is that is hostile territory if Russia were to do some type of pincer move, whether they start putting more mechanized divisions, companies, battalions in that area to try to like start moving from the west and east and kind of bridge that gap. Now from the few people I spoke to that are actually in Ukraine, they're in Crimea, and it's as if nothing's really happening not 150 kilometers away. So I find that to be quite interesting, that people are kind of living their lives as if nothing's necessarily going on. To me, what I see, it resembles something like gang warfare, where you have these, these I don't call them white nationalists. I hate using that word, but Ukrainian nationalists that are, covered in tattoos. They probably don't really have all that much going for them. You have that faction. You classify them as Azov battalions, Azov brigades. And then you have the Russian military, where it appears that you have the Chechens involved, and you have these kind of like these reservists that are fighting that look quite young, like under the ages of 21, and they're being commanded by guys that are like 55 and older. So you see these guys that are like kind of like gray beards, kind of weathered, beaten up, barking orders at some baby-faced 19-year-olds. I don't see that much as far as, modern equipment. I haven't seen many T-90 tanks, very few T-90 tanks. See a lot of T-64s, T-72s, a lot of, artillery pieces. I haven't seen too much of this whole techno war with drones, and it's really hard for me to digest all this because the propaganda piece of it showing us drone warfare and all these modern missiles, and you see all that, and then but you see at the ground level, you see rusty AK-47s and guys using weaponry and equipment from like 1985. What's your take on that?
So for the drone thing, so many analysts and people say, oh, it's the drone era. Look at their price, look at their effectiveness. And I think this war has disproven that to some degree. When it comes to Bayraktar TB2, which is a drone that was used in Syria, it was used most famously in the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And in this in this war that happened in 2020, what we saw is that it was kind of like right now where Ukraine was winning its information war, winning on social media, but on the ground, not having that much of success as they claim to have. And that's what was going on in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia, because of its populations in America and the influence they have, they had a lot of support on social media, and they were saying, hey, we're winning this war. They were showing, supposed Azerbaijani casualties, and there were some. But what the Azeri side had was the TB2 footage of them just every day, 20 pieces of footage, 30 pieces of footage of hitting Armenian positions, hitting Armenian rocket artillery, hitting Armenian infantry, hitting Armenian artillery pieces. And the Armenians really did not have an effective anti-air system to take these down. They did have some, but like 1 or 2 units of like the Panzer S1 to take these down. A lot were taken down, but not enough to really save the war for them. Because the Armenians in the first Nagorno-Karabakh war actually took the whole area and won a decisive victory against the Azerbaijanis, who always outnumbered them. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had this war happen, and it happened again in 2020, and Azerbaijan won this time. But in Ukraine, we saw like 3 pieces of footage of the Takbar TB2, and it's a very overhyped system. Like, Ukrainian soldiers made a song of it, and they thought it was going to be, we're going to see the same amount of footage. Again, we've seen like recycled footage, and like we only seen from the start of the war like three hits on like anti-air systems, the Buk anti-airs. That's about it. There hasn't been, because most of these things were shredded up, they were shot down. The Russians have very sophisticated electronic warfare that can jam, reduce the capability of these units, and then they have layered anti-air defense that can take all these down, and that's what seems to have happened. You see picture evidence of all these UAVs shredded up. Now the TB2, what's good about it, it's a $2 million unit, and that makes it very, very affordable. But its fleet in Ukraine, which they had a fleet of up to 50 of these things, which is pretty sizable, all of them were pretty much destroyed. And that showed that properly, used anti-air, properly trained anti-air can shred drones. Other drones, you have like the Switchblade, and then you have like the Zolta pyramid
system. And from what I understand, those are not working out so well.
They're not. There has been videos of the work.
It's as if a lot of the
So the Iranian general of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, he was believed to be killed by the 300 model of the Switchblade drone when he was killed in Iraq during the Trump administration. But there has been footage because the United States have sent about 300, and they're about to send 500 more of these Switchblade drones, and they have been used. They've been used in like infantry, but the thing is, it injures, and it's been used against a tank. It damages a tank. It's not. Again, we haven't got to that point where we can really miniaturize technology. These things are really overhyped. So no, we haven't seen that much footage. So that also goes with the Stingers and the Javelins, is that the Javelins and the Stingers and the Carl Gustaf launchers, they've been sent to such a high quantity. Also the NLAWs from Britain and the Panzer weapons from Germany. They've all been sent in such a high quantity that there's no military on Earth that has like the amount of anti-tank per soldier than the Ukrainians. It's like 4 times what the average U.S. Army platoon will have on hand. So the Ukrainians are flooded with anti-tank weaponry, but it hasn't been that effective. It hasn't been that much of a game changer. It may, there's Russian tanks that survive like 20 hits. It depends. There's a large variety of tanks, but like Russian modernized T-72 2016 version of a T-72B3, which has like, it's basically a T-90 on the cheap. You take the T-72 and try to put it to T-90 standard instead of making a T-90. So those tanks usually they can take up to like they've been known to take up to 20 hits of like different anti-tank weapons. And this anti-tank strategy hasn't worked out in Ukraine that much. It hasn't. Okay, I mean, Russian equipment. There's been significant Russian losses of Russian equipment, but again, a lot of this is old stock. A lot of this is upgraded old stock. This is stuff they need, like they're gonna scrap anyways in a few years. Yeah, it's losses anyways. There has been Ukrainian success. It's like tactical. So there's three layers of war. There's a tactical, which is like a squad on squad, tank on tank engagement, like who wins that one. And then there's the operational. It's like, okay, how do I get my company and platoon resupplied, and where do they move? And then there's the strategic. It's like, okay, how do we conduct this whole war effort? Where do we move our divisions? And so on a tactical scale, yeah, there's been Ukrainian, they've defeated Russian army, they've routed Russian units, sure. But again, for the amount of anti-tank weapons the NATO countries have flooded into the country, there hasn't been like the proportional effectiveness you would expect, which tells me is that this is what the Axis tried again at the end of the war. What was Nazi Germany doing? It was giving producing a lot of cheap anti-tank units to counter the Russian armor advances, and that didn't work out so well. That just got a lot of people killed, like the Volkssturm that they mobilized at the end with these rocket launchers on the cheap. So yeah, we're seeing kind of like the similar strategy, and it's that thing's not working out. Where most casualties in World War One and World War Two occurred was artillery. It was like 65% of casualties, and that's the same for this war. So most equipment on both sides being destroyed by artillery, and that's where Russia over time has gotten the upper advantage. And that's what's causing kind of things to turn in their favor in Donbass. There's a Western article that interviewed some Ukrainian soldiers and some volunteers on the front lines, and they said for every 3 shells we fire, the Russians fire 300. So I think what's kind of evident now is artillery is going to be the most decisive thing. Air power, in this kind of conflict is really overrated because
where is let me interject here. So my question is, okay, where is the Ukrainian military? And I'm asking that as a layman because all I see is this Azov brigade nonsense being wielded around in RT, even on CNN, some of the mainstream media, even Telegram groups, etc., etc. I don't see an actual, conscripted Ukrainian military fighting Russian forces. I see a bunch of gangbangers that are young, covered in tattoos, doing the bulk of the fighting in Mariupol and some of the other regions. Where is this large Ukrainian military that I heard so much about? I think it's someone quoted that they have the largest standing army in Europe, and I found that to be quite laughable because are you including some peasant farmer in sandals with a rusted AK-47 as part of the Ukrainian military? I mean, let's take this into consideration. We're talking about the second poorest nation in Europe. It's also the largest nation in Europe. Okay, it has not had a positive GDP. It's had the same GDP since the fall of the Soviet Union since 1991. It has not. It's remained stagnant since then. Okay, most of their military equipment is leftovers, hand-me-downs from Russia. They're running out of ammunition because, well, guess what? Who supplied most of their equipment? Russia did, right? You're also looking at the economic side of this, the financial side of this, is that the U.S. has given Ukraine, what, $70 billion? If help me out first, is it $70 billion? I think it's more closer to like $100 billion if you count like some black money, part of the dirt pop. So let's say it's $100 billion. Do you know how much money the Russians have spent on this military expenditure? $3 billion. So if you're throwing $100 billion at this war effort, and you kind of got them this bit of a quagmire, which we can get into about Russian military strategy in a moment. but this hasn't really caused Russia that much economic damage, at least as far as the war effort goes. I'm not talking about sanctions and everything else, but you need bodies to fight this war, and it doesn't seem like the average Ukrainian male wants to fight Russia. Like, they're kind of half-assing it, and the only ones really engaging the Russian military is these Ukrainian gangbangers, because that's the best way I can describe them.
Yeah, so I also wonder this. This has been really puzzling because at the start of the war, Ukraine did, as soon as the Donbass War happens, and in 2015 they lose that whole war, they go back to the drawing board. They go to NATO partners. They start cycling troops to do trainings with NATO. They start getting equipment from the West. They start modernizing their own equipment. Ukraine does modernize its old Soviet tanks, as like the Oplot system. There's all these systems that they sometimes export and use themselves domestically. And they were acquiring a bunch of drones, UAVs, westernizing their army, mixing, Western equipment, Soviet equipment, still mostly Soviet equipment. But, in some ways, Ukraine, self-propelled artillery, like Gvozdikas, they actually inherited a bit more than Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed. So in some ways, they were really well stocked up. A lot of that was lost in Donbass Wars, but still,
Right.
Ukraine has tens of thousands of pieces of military equipment. Now, what's happened is when Russia invaded with about 180,000, then you add the Donbass militaries, Lugansk 14,000, then that's 20,000, about 200,000 allied forces. Ukrainians had that just in their active military. And then they had about 600,000 in reserves. Now, the quality of those reserves are questionable. But here are three branches of the Ukrainian military that kind of been destroyed. So the Ukrainian Air Force size in 2022 was 35,000. That's been destroyed. 225 aircraft, mostly all gone, destroyed.
Right.
So they're able to still fly some missions like Su-25s and stuff. Why is that? Is because the Soviets made it, like when they started with the MiG-21, they did not run these things on paved, sometimes really good airfields. They had that strategy that, hey, we're not going to have the most ample of conditions. We might have to fly these things out of like a flat field somewhere in the Urals or something. So since then, yeah, the Ukrainians are able to hide like an Su-25 here or there and launch it from like a field in eastern Ukraine. So does the Ukrainian Air Force still operate? Yeah, briefly. They've done like a helicopter night raid into Russia itself. So yeah, but most of its equipment has been destroyed. That's visually confirmed. Airfields destroyed. That was the first bombings. Russia bombed 83 positions of Ukrainian military on day one. So that's 35,000 troops in the Ukrainian Air Force that largely don't exist anymore. They've been either killed or they've been dissolved because the Ukrainian Air Force doesn't really operate that much. Then you have the naval forces. The Navy does not exist anymore. All their ships have been taken out, captured, blockaded, sunk themselves. 15,000. That's 15,000 naval troops. So, and then you have the naval infantry, which were stationed in Mariupol, and we'll get to that, the Battle of Mariupol. Now that's 6,000 in 2022, and so there you have it: 6,000, 15,000, 135,000. That's 56,000 troops that are kind of out of action. They cannot coordinate any attacks. They cannot be a part. They cannot really work within their branch. So what's left over is the Ukrainian army and the territorial defense forces. So the territorial defense forces they're potentially millions of men, because right now Ukraine has locked down the country. There's about 6-7 million people have left. Again, that's added to the 8 million people have left since 2014. So the country's at, when you take away the separatist areas and everything and what they've lost, they're down to 30 million people probably at this point, 32, 33. But still, if they're if they're mobilizing or they're conscripting every male 18 to 60, that's millions of men. That's 3 million men at least. Okay, cut it in half because maybe not everyone can perform. That's still 1.5 million. That's a huge military. The Russian military at this point, after its losses, is probably 180, 175. That's in the field, and so that's where I wonder if and Ukraine's on its 6th wave of mobilization. The Western equipment has poured in for over 90 days now. Where is the Ukrainian military? Because how is usually the common like wisdom in attacking is you have to outnumber your enemy by 3 to 1. That's kind of been disproven wrong with this whole situation now. But that's the thing is Ukrainians should be pushing, like, the Russians should still not be advancing in Donbass as they are. Ukrainians have had some success. There is some things I question, like the Kyiv. You remember the 40-mile convoy and like the Kyiv and people saying what's encirclement. Do you remember how Russian eventually pulled out of Kyiv in the northern front, which they invaded out of Belarus, and they also pulled out of Chernobyl.
I figured they were just redirecting forces to focus on Mariupol and the Donbass region. I didn't think too much of it. Sacking the capital is not as important as it used to be like 100 years ago.
Right. Yeah. So when this war started, I knew two things.
Real quick. I just want to interject one point here. The country has more citizens over the age of 65 than working age population between 20 and 65.
Yeah, I mean that's the unfortunate thing is the demographics of this country is just gonna get destroyed. It was already very bad, but we'll get to that after this. So yeah, so when this I guess escalation of the already ongoing civil war for 8 years, this Russian intervention in it, there was basically 4 ways of attack. There was coming up from Crimea to get the water, because the Ukrainians have blockaded water to Crimea since 2014, and the whole place has been under a severe drought, like down to like 2%, 5% water. So the Russian military had to move in and deblock that, so water could flow. So you had that, and then you had the Kharkiv sector movement from there, and then you had of course the Donbass one, and then you had the Kyiv from I guess it's 5 direction of attack. You have the Kyiv coming from Belarus through Chernobyl, and then you have coming from a bit east of that into Sumy and Cherniv. So, and that was kind of the supposed kind of encirclement, but here's where the encirclement idea doesn't work out, because the troops involved in getting close to Kiev were, first it was VDV forces that flew into Gostomel Airport. There's videos of them, and none of their helicopters got shot down. Actually, the Ukrainians tried, but all their Stingers and Strellas failed. There's video evidence of that. They said like they shot down 2 IL-76s. There's no evidence for that at all. There's some Ukrainian cargo planes that went down near there. But yeah, there was a successful VDV insertion into Gostomel Airport, which is a military airport. It actually hosted the largest airplane in the world there. It got destroyed. I'm not sure if you saw that. The Antonov.
I heard about it.
Yeah.
Haka told me about it.
Yeah. It got destroyed there. And then you had more VDV forces, which have like the BDRM APC, which is like very it's an infantry fighting vehicle, not an APC, but it's basically VDV operates very light armored vehicles, because they're supposed to do paradrops and stuff like that. They're not a sustained force. They're not like the tank guards or something that can fight for like 60 days and like frontal assaults. So that's what the thing is. There was about 30,000 troops on that front, and it's the VDV. It doesn't make sense that this force is supposed to take the city of 3 million. That made no sense at all. So that's when, to some people they said, hey, it's actually a diversion. It's so the Ukrainians cannot reinforce the Donbass front where they're the most entrenched. They can shift their forces to Kiev and panic. And you had Western analysts come and they said, oh, we estimate that Kiev's going to fall in 96 hours. And which to me, this was basically a propaganda. It's to say, well, the Russians didn't take it in 96 hours. What's going on? They failed their invasion. No, I don't think they ever intended to really try to take the capital with only 30,000, 35,000 at most, lightly armored VDV troops. That didn't make sense to me. But there's still that's where kind of a lot of the significant losses for the Russians started piling up. Like you see a lot of destroyed convoys and stuff like that. That was probably done by artillery because you have such a defender's advantage. You know where the enemy's coming from. You know the roads they're using. You know the coordinates of that. You know how to position your artillery to fire on that. The Ukrainians, like within the city of Kiev, they would position like at a shopping mall. There's one that got destroyed. They were storing like Grad launchers in there and driving around Grad trucks. One of the first pictures that came out of Kiev was a partially destroyed apartment building, but that was actually a Strela 10 operated by Ukraine that failed. Was locking on to something in the air, I think to a ballistic or one of the cruise missiles, and it hit them, and they said, oh, it's a Russian missile attack. No, it wasn't. It was a anti-air missile that Ukraine launched. So, but still, to me, it's still bad optics to lose troops, and then have, like the Bucha massacre. You had like a lot of Russian equipment left behind that was destroyed there. Some, Russians got trapped there and executed, like the POWs. Still, I mean, even if it's a distraction, it's such a bad look for Russia to do that because, again, it shows losses. It shows you are falling back. You're giving the enemy basically propaganda to basically, oh, say, we can win this. We can, mobilize more troops, West sending more equipment, So I was kind of scratching my head at that. But now with recent events, 2 months later, it kind of starts to make sense. So they've pulled out of that front, and then the war kind of moved to the east. Russians pull out of North Ukraine, and now we have, if you look at the map, you kind of have most of the war ongoing is the war in the Donbass. So it's quickly approaching Slavyansk, which was that first city to rebel with Igor Strzelkov went to and fended off the Ukrainian military until he retreated. It's going to that, and where the Ukrainian military is now, what its situation is, it's fortified, it's entrenched, and that's the problem with invasions is you do not want your enemies entrenched. The reason why the United States invasion of Iraq was successful is because the Iraqis did not entrench themselves. They did not dig even cover for their own tanks. They left them out in the open. That's the worst thing about doing an assault is if the enemy's entrenched, it's behind cover, it's behind dugout positions, it's hard to dislodge them, it's hard to they have more sight than you, they know where you're coming from, their weapons are set up and sighted in, and that's where the Ukrainians have the most advantage is in the Donbass area. It's because let's say I give you 8 years to train from your bedroom window, and in 8 years I'm going to come down and attack you, and I basically give you time to sight in a rifle, buy your optic, sight it in, practice for 8 years shooting, and you set up that rifle for 8 years to hit exactly where I'm going to be coming from in the driveway. That's exactly what the Ukrainian military was having preparation for. The Donbass area is the most fortified and staffed with the most trained and supplied Ukraine troops. So when the Donbass war kind of came to a standstill, the Ukrainian military created this ATO zone, this kind of front line, and they poured a lot of concrete. They made a lot of bunkers. They made a lot of basically entrenched a lot of ammunition, supplies. They made like a lot of really like well-made bunkers with like heating system, cooling systems. Like some of the rebels that captured the trenches now, they're like looking at it like, wow, this is like, we were living in like complete shit. Like these guys had like a pretty luxury system here. Like it was basically like the Maginot Line the French had prepared in around World War II. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but that's where the Ukrainians have the most advantage.
Yeah, it's Maginot.
Yeah, is the Don, because they have all their artillery sighted in. They know where the enemy's going to come from. There's only so many roads. They know the coordinates where to fire artillery. They know where to fire their static weaponry. They know what they can see, what they can't see. It's a total defender's advantage. So that's why I think the Kiev thing happened, is to not allow them to staff more troops there. Because again, concrete bunkers, everything. Good luck dislodging that. But what's going on now, which is kind of impresses me, and I am kind of, you know what the Western media does is like they show a picture of a destroyed Russian tank. Half the time it's a Ukrainian tank because they both operate like similar systems. But some, you can tell a T-64, you can tell,
Right.
like
Yeah.
they use like the Ukrainians use like pixelated patterns, and that's only for their like most modern tanks. They also use like green camo. So many of the times when they're showing you, oh, destroyed Russian equipment, no, it's Ukrainian equipment. And you know, for right now, for what people can like verify and double verify, it's a 2-to-1. It's a 2-to-1, which is not as good as what the rebels had 10-to-1, but that was an insurgency. But I think the West narrative wants to say, yeah, the Ukrainians, they have the chance, they have this. But the losses of equipment, at least on the Russian side, has been greatly overestimated. Like a damaged tank is not necessary; it can be recovered, can be repaired. There's a lot of things they say, oh, that's a destroyed tank with its turrets popped off. Well, that's a Ukrainian tank. That's an upgraded T-64. I mean, there was a CNN, they recently went on the battlefield and they showed, destroyed like Russian tank column or something, and it was Ukrainian with pixel camo. Again, this keeps happening. The average viewer doesn't know. It doesn't know. I'll show you a tank, and you know, the Wall Street Journal had a picture like, oh, Russian military mistakes, and it's like, it shows this is a Ukrainian tank you're showing. It's like they don't know, and nobody knows. So that's the problem. Is the tank is not good. The drone is really good PR.
Let me ask you. What,
Yeah.
Sorry, let me interject. What is exactly the casualties on both sides? Like, I can't get good figures on that. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point it's between 6-to-1 to 10-to-1 in Russia's favor. I'd say if you include the Donetsk militias,
But we don't actually have like a death count like we did in Syria.
well, you know, the Syrian death count's very inaccurate because the one on like that the West took is by one guy in London. It was called like the Syrian Observation for Human Rights or something. Like the casualty counts in Syria are done by one pro-rebel guy, pro-FSA guy in Britain. Like that's the problem with casualty counts, and why my estimations, again, these should not, even people should do their own research, and what they think is like 4,000 dead for Russia and allied militias, like Donetsk People's Republics, Lugansk People's Republics, that's like all American casualties for the Iraq War over that whole time, not including contractors. So that is pretty sizable. In the Ukrainian ones, I'd estimate dead would be 40,000. So that 1 to 10. But again, here's the thing where people might be like, you know, they might get, you know, there's a lot of ethnic Ukrainians that they don't know their language, they don't know their history, they don't know their relatives over there, but somehow they're in there is some like huge patriotic fervor all of a sudden because it's played on TV. Look, who's advancing? Who has the most troops and who's advancing? Russia's advancing with a sword. They're outnumbered like 1-5, 1-6 at this point because, again, they're not doing a general mobilization. They're using a quarter of their professional military, and they haven't like added more reinforcements, like physical men.
to the front. They've just shifted their old the North Kiev front over to the Donbass front. Yet the Ukrainians they're mobilizing millions of men, and they're the ones retreating right now. They're the ones falling back out of their static positions, out of their fortified positions, the positions that are hard to get people out of. So how is that possible if the Russians are destroyed, or Russians have taken huge casualties? That would not be possible. So I think this Russia's like destroyed, or they lost one old ship in the Black Sea. I think there's a lot of coping going on as to overestimate it, because when they show like that Bucha, they show that like destroyed Russian column. Yeah, that's like 4 APCs and like a tank and like a couple IV. Yeah, that's that's a tactical loss. But here's the thing: is what is the job of an APC? What is the job of an infantry fight? It's to protect the infantry inside. That's why you don't see dead bodies on the side rarely when it comes to the Russian equipment, because it's done its job. If it's destroyed and the crew survives inside, yeah, maybe they get tinnitus in 1 year or something, or some burns, but they survive. It's done its job. And what people are doing, they say, oh, every destroyed Russian APC, that means 8 guys dead. No, that doesn't mean that. Usually you have actually high survival rates in modern armor. Even in Syria, when they were using old T-62s, and they would get hit by an you see the guys, jump out and run out all the time on the propaganda videos for the rebels. So these things are survivable. The equipment's lost. Yeah, it's a destroyed tank. But that's the thing. While what the Ukrainians are losing, they're losing lots of infantry. What's that?
Digressing, how about the situation on the coastline? Does Ukraine have any ports? What's the situation in Odessa? And from my estimation, just going back in history, once they lose the entire coastline, I don't see how much longer Ukraine could hold on without having more foreign intervention, in addition to the money that they sent over for material.
Yeah, the coast is very important to Ukraine. Without it, it becomes a very landlocked country and falls into deeper poverty. So Ukraine is a agricultural export powerhouse. And how does it export? Almost all of its grain is through the ports. Ports of Odessa, ports of Mariupol. And Mariupol's taken. Other ports are taken. What's left is Odessa. The problem with Odessa is the Ukrainians have mined it in a hasty manner, and some of those mines are washing up, like in Turkey. They're all over, so a lot of commercial ships are avoiding that area. Also, it's blockaded by the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So and right now we're having this like food crisis, which is really done by the Ukrainians and NATO, because they're the ones who put mines everywhere for commercial ships to kind of like say, hey, this area is not even worth it to operate in. So that's the thing is, yeah, they have Odessa that's left, but as long as it's blockaded and there's mines floating around, there's like 4 mines that washed up in Turkey. There's one that exploded on some foreign freight carrier. So that's the issue. They still have the port of Nikolaev, which is like deeper. It still has access once you go from there into the Black Sea. And it can launch anti-shipping missiles from there. So they haven't lost everything yet. But so far they don't have use of their like maritime their naval abilities at all. They can't export anything. They can't receive anything through the water. And yeah, they're basically landlocked for now. And so on the sea, it's a lost cause. They've lost the naval battle at very low cost to Russia. Russia still has its fleet there. Yeah, it lost that like one old ship, okay, and like 2 patrol boats. So what? The whole Ukrainian Navy, which is tens of thousands, is gone. Where are all those personnel? Were they operating? Nothing. They can still launch anti-ship missiles, which are effective. So what they're trying to do right now is, you heard of that Snake Island thing, that big propaganda thing where they said "F you, Russian warship,"
yes.
but that never happened. They all got captured. There was like 70 of them. They all got captured and they were shown, and it was basically a propaganda piece. And they surrendered all orderly. So right now that island's being fought over, and the Ukrainians are desperately sending troops and like helicopters and like boats of infantry over there to try to take it. The first thing they tried was a disaster, but they were probably going to try again, because if they can take that, there's not a lot of islands in the Black Sea, but if they take Snake Island, they can put anti-shipping missiles on that island, which can reach Sevastopol in where the Russian Navy is in Crimea. So it can actually hit the naval ships where they dock at. So that island is actually very important, and Ukraine is getting access to these anti-shipping missiles, which is a great escalation of the war. So that's the thing, is Ukraine does not have like a naval ability anymore, but it still has a counter naval ability. But its exports are blocked. It's right now it's de facto landlocked. So that's kind of the state of the coasts. Of the coast.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened with the sinking of the Moscow? Because there was a lot of disinfo. There's reports that it had sunk when it was under tow. We don't have a casualty list or the amount of casualties the Russians had lost when it was hit by, I'm assuming, not that I'm assuming, a land-fired anti-ship missile. You know anything a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we just gotta look at the objective things and move on. The ship is lost. It's a war loss. Whether it was the ammunition explosion or was an anti-ship missile, accidents do happen. There's ships in America that, remember the ships in the Chinese Sea that were colliding all the time, and there's a ship that burned down in a naval dock in America. So I mean, there's accidents all the time, even when a nation's at peace. So it's possible that an accident happened, or it could be an anti-shipping missile. The thing is, I'm more doubting the anti-shipping missile, because we would have seen more by now. We would have seen more of this anti-shipping missile hits by now. So for casualties, at least one sailor has died, 20 were injured, and there's picture evidence that most made it back, because there's a formation picture of all of them after the whole thing. But the ship is actually the Moskva. I mean, yeah, it's a flagship, but it's actually very old. It's like past its when you should kind of decommission it. It doesn't have the most advanced weapon systems, but it's still a loss. It's still a loss for the Russian Navy, but they still have the Black Sea Fleet. They're still operating. They're still launching their cruise missiles into Ukraine almost every day. You know, and a lot of these cruise missiles, they destroy barracks. They kill like hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers for each volley. So if they're able to do that, if they're still able to operate in the sea, that's still every day they are able to. That's hundreds of Ukrainians soldiers potentially dead. So yeah, I don't think it's a Ukrainian propaganda victory, but in the end, you know, I look at this like whole effort, you know, there's a lot of, you know, ethnic Ukrainians or Ukrainians outnumber Russians in the West by like 3 to 1 more, because Russia never had a higher immigration rate than immigration rate, even during the 90s collapse. But Ukraine had a lot of people leave, especially post-Maidan, 8 million, and now you have 6 million. The country's so all these people are like, Canada has a big, I mean, America, we have a big. So you have a lot of efforts, you know, propaganda efforts, you know, Marvel movie efforts on the Ukrainian side, and a lot of these are Ukrainian expats. They don't know the language, they don't know the history, they've never set foot on Ukraine. They might have like a distant relative there they've never talked to, and it reminds me of the Coney. Remember the Coney 2012 thing?
Yeah, yes.
So that was kind of 2012 changed a lot of things. That was like the end of the Mayan calendar, and you know, a lot of people tell me, and I myself stay like, that was really the end of the world and start of something new and hellish. But in 2012, that was kind of like the first experiment with like social media driven political movements to like take out like an actual like war target, and that never worked. I mean, I don't know if Coney ever got captured, but it didn't seem like that. And that was like a small African warlord. So that same social media, and the United States is definitely buying off content creators. It's buying off people like Vosh and people like Phil Spencer or whatever that guy is. That's like a used to be like a right winger. Now he's a he used to be like a white nationalist. Now he has a NATO flag, the Ukrainian flag, because like his wife is Russian and left them, and now he's angry. But you have these content creators that were big, and all of a sudden they're like shilling for NATO, and like all of a sudden they're like full force like a war propagandist, and it's like, what the hell? Like, you were like a Twitch streamer. And this is obvious. This is the new policy of the West, because the West, does information warfare way better than Russia can. It has way higher soft power than Russia can ever hope for. It's mobilizing its entertainers. It's mobilizing, like Zelensky's a comedian, but like the Biden administration invited the top 30 or 20 most subscribed to like youth content creators on TikTok to tell them like, hey, this is what you should say in the Ukrainian crisis, basically advising them on how to talk about it, so that's the thing. There's a huge social media effort, but these social media efforts, they don't really work out. They didn't work out for Armenia. They didn't work out for Kony 2012. So if you can't even take out an African warlord, how do you hope to handle like a full industrial state military? It doesn't seem to be working out as we see. I honestly think that there is still a way for Ukraine to win this, actually. But I mean, every day that this goes on is the less that happens. When Ukraine started pushing back on the Kyiv front and the Russians started leaving their positions, I was like, what the heck? I mean, they're getting close to the Russian border now. But now, again, that hasn't really yielded much strategic significance. But if they're able to mobilize like a 1,000,000-man army, and they're able to train in Germany and Poland, which they're doing now in artillery systems, if the West, because the whole West, the EU plus America plus like New Zealand, Australia, they're able to outproduce Russia. They can, if they wanted to, in military equipment, because when you take all the anti-Russian states versus Russia, that's 25 times the economy. So they're able to, if they really put their nose to the grindstone, to outproduce Russia in equipment, and Ukraine can provide the military, and the West has basically have a policy that we're going to fight to the last Ukrainians. They're throwing Ukrainian soldiers into a meat grinder, and that's all coming out now. There's so many videos of Ukrainian battalions and companies they're pleading with their commanders. They're shooting these social media videos. Hey, we don't want to fight anymore. We don't get the right equipment. They don't have like 30 rounds they can fire. Like that's what's weird to me. No body armor. Like, there's so much money flowing to Ukraine, but it's not reaching these frontline guys. It's like it's getting siphoned. It's a lot of what's going on in Ukraine. It's just a money laundering operation for U.S. elites, for Western elites. Is to, hey, you're a politician, and I'm your buddy, and I have this contracting company that's gonna ship all this stuff, and we'll all get kickbacks off of it. I mean, so that's the thing. Is I question is, how is the Russians still able to advance when all the advantages are in the Ukrainians, like the manpower, the logistics lines, the support from the West. It's honestly, it's a miracle.
I think it comes down to a will to fight. I don't think the Ukrainians have much of a will to fight.
I don't think most do, because here's the thing: is do you want to fight or die, or are you going to just go to the EU where you have a comfortable life? Now, they have caught, this is official statistic by the Ukrainian government, this was months ago, is they've caught 2,200 young men, like, trying to cross the border into the West, like, to escape. And a lot of them, like, froze to death and died, and like, but that's probably an underestimate. I mean, if they gave a big number, that would really, like, everyone would be like, hey, everyone's trying to escape, I'm gonna escape, I'm not gonna fight. So 2,200, that's probably underestimated by 10. Let's say 22,000. And what you see a lot of like countries in the Baltics and in Poland, you see a lot of young men. You see a lot of young hooligans around, giving pro-Ukrainian chants, but they're not fighting on the front line. So where are all the young men? The dead Ukrainian soldiers, the hundreds that there's pictures of that come out, almost day by day. A lot of them are just old men in the 40s and 50s, and there is this theory that they're holding back all the young, kind of fresh troops that can learn and operate equipment and are fast learners. They're holding them back, like in the West, for like they're gonna create the Western Army, and that's when they're done training and everything on Western equipment, they're gonna roll up. And there's some merit to that theory because we haven't seen some of the donated equipment like the M113s, which is a infantry fighting vehicle. It's kind of like a death trap, but nevertheless it can transport troops. So that's the thing, is where is the Ukrainian military? I mean, right now in the Donbass, what we have is, I mean, the Russians just took the city of Liman, like without any like use of force really, because the Ukrainians just straight up retreated from there, which is strange because the more the Ukrainians retreat, the less they have an advantage because they don't have those 8 years of preparations. They don't have those concrete bunkers. They're retreating to like foxholes now. So that's not good as entrenchment of cover, line of sight. That's, you lose those benefits. So that's the thing. I maybe there is like a Western army in Ukraine being prepped, and if that's the case, there's good chance that the Ukrainians can push the Russians back, because they just have the numbers, and Russia hasn't fully mobilized. It's trying to cover too much land. If you look at the size of the front line, it's just huge. You can't do that with 200,000 troops. So that's the thing.
Yeah.
And if Ukrainians and that's the thing, is the Axis powers, they said, oh, the Soviets are going to mobilize like 30 divisions, and they ended up like mobilizing like 600 or something insane. So there is maybe there has been some Ukrainian successes. The Ukrainians are close to the Russian border. I mean, within a day they could enter the Russian border. I mean, if they really push through, it'd be very painful, but they can, and that could be a really good propaganda victory for them. But I just don't get it yet. Again, this is something that time will tell. But so far, I was really pessimistic at some points. I'm like, what is the Russian military doing? What is Putin doing? Like, this is not good. They're pushing back. Ukrainians are pushing back on the key front. Donbass is moving too slow because we still haven't seen one encirclement, because the rebels were able to achieve encirclements in 2014 and 2015 in the Ukrainian army, but there still hasn't been, besides Mariupol, which was a big success, there hasn't been significant encirclements otherwise in the Donbass area. Not yet. They're getting close to one, and this past week the last week has been really successful for Russian and the separatist troops there. But there's still definitely a chance Ukraine, if they get that Western equipment, they train on it, they mobilize, they get the best, but again, the longer time passes, the more I doubt it.
What is the long-term strategy for Russia during this expedition, this war? And what is Ukraine's long-term plan? What is the point of this war? I just found the timing of it to be a bit strange. Russia could have mounted this during the COVID lockdowns. I'm a little bit skeptical as far as Russia's intentions, because you hear a lot of this, this denazification rhetoric, which is similar to that rhetoric which we hear in the United States. So I question that quite a bit, because they're using the word Nazi in the same vein as white supremacist. A lot of people push back on the idea that this is fighting against global homo. I just got done reading the book Twilight of Abundance, and there is a part about Ukraine in it, and how much wheat and grain comes out of Ukraine. It definitely supplies quite a bit of it to Africa. Then you have the energy factor to all this. What's your 2 cents?
Yeah, those are all valid and important factors in this that are getting overlooked. But let's start on the Russian strategy. So at this point, what I think it's to basically to destroy as much of the Ukrainian military as possible. Again, the Navy is destroyed, the Air Force is largely destroyed, and the Marine Corps is destroyed, along with Azov, which is a probably the number one target, because it was the most anti-Russian, legitimate, integrated into the military, huge unit, the most motivated troops they ever had. They just surrendered like 2,400 troops of their Azov in Mariupol. So, but I don't think Russia is going to be, once they're done with the Donbass, I would be very skeptical to see if they push past that. So basically taking the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, which at this rate they would probably take by July or August. So take the proclaimed territory of those people's republics. As far as Odessa, I'm not sure. Again, you don't have enough troops for that. So I think it's to take a chunk of eastern Ukraine and hold it, and then basically keep destroying any semblance of Ukrainian like war industry. Kind of like Plan Ost the Nazis had for Russia or Soviet Union, to like push them back to the Urals and bomb them every time they try to do something. It's something similar to that. Basically have the anti-Russian sentiment just move to the EU, just leave the country eventually, and just abandon the whole country. I think that's the case. This war is going to go on for a while. The Ukrainian objective is to it's to push Russia and all of its pre 2014 territory. So push them out of Crimea, push them out of Donetsk and Lugansk, and to keep them there. And again, that if the most optimal situation happens in Ukraine, it's still very possible to do that. But you know, again, as time goes on, the more demoralization happens in the Ukrainian ranks, and the propaganda kind of wears off, and the losses start to become real and in your face. So that's the thing. And then when it comes to the Nazi thing, that is legitimate. So people, here's the most common argument. Well, it can't be Nazis. They have a Jewish president. It's like, well, you can be a racist, and he can't be a racist. He hired a bunch of black people at his restaurant. He's not racist. Well, yes, I'm racist against Asians. So there's not this like whole blanket thing. You can cherry pick, and you can be anti-Slavic Nazi, but they're the head of the foreign ministry for Russia, Sergei Lavrov, told he basically told one of the Israeli ambassadors, and there was an outcry over it. He said, Israel as it stands is supporting Nazis in Ukraine. They're not anti-Semitic Nazis, but they're anti-Russian Nazis, and that's the case. Yeah, Azov Battalion, Adar Battalion, these are all people who killed innocent Russians. They've bombed Russians. They've killed Russian POWs. So yeah, they're an anti-Russian force, and that is again, it's not anti-Semitic Nazism, but it's a Russophobic Nazism. So that's the case. Those elements exist, and those are the most motivated Ukrainian troops. So those forces exist. It's undeniable. They've been integrated into the Ukrainian military. It's if like the KKK got its own like regiment in the U.S. Army. So it has, those elements are there, and they're the most motivated. They're the troops that have to be taken out as fast as possible for Russia. When it comes to energy, I think this is why Putin's doing it now than ever, is because we are reaching the twilight of abundance. I think that's the best description. If people were telling me, how do you describe the 2020s? Is going to be the twilight of abundance, and that's the era we're in. Is there was this big lie in the United States that we're energy independent. Look, we're the number one oil producer. But what happened is in 1971, curiously, when the gold standard ended and productivity decoupled from wages, you have that graph, is we hit what Dr. King Hubbard, he was the one who kind of discovered all this and put it into a graph, is conventional oil peak in the United States. So the United States, part of the reason why it became the global superpower it was the first to make use of conventional oil, to really exploit it, and because of that, it's the first to run out of conventional oil. So conventional oil is the type of where you stick, like in Texas, you just stick like a big straw basically, and just shoots out of the ground. And so we've run out of that easy stuff in the United States, and what we have now left over is hydraulic fracking. And hydraulic fracking is very expensive, is because you're drilling like sideways, and you're basically putting like shooting water into like rock sediment and down into like deep earth crust to get oil out. And this oil, it's not like the heavy crude we used to have. It's like called light sweet crude. It's not as energy dense. It's not as consistent. So it needs to be mixed with heavier crude. And that's what we don't produce. The reason why we have a diesel shortage, we have a kerosene, which is used to make Jet 1A, all these fuels, is because America's not energy independent. And there was lies told the American public. Here's the evidence: the gas prices. Just look at them. Look at the diesel price. Look at the gas prices. That's all you need to know. Is that there's a war in Ukraine and it's getting worse. So who's really like winning this? Who's really like affected by this? It seems like the American people are. Because America's not an energy independent country. It has a huge population that's car dependent. It doesn't have any like viable public transportation or very energy efficient systems to move massive people. So people's standards of living is going to go down because America cannot produce energy for its population, and you're going to see gas prices getting higher. Vehicles getting more expensive. Everything gets more expensive. When sometimes a lot of goods you see in grocery stores, most of the cost of that is not because of the good. It's because of the transport. The transport's the main part of the price. And now everything's going to go up because America is not energy independent. It still requires. It was buying diesel from Russia. It was buying. Yeah, it wasn't that much, but it's still very necessary. That little shock, that 3 to 5%, is a big deal. Hey, your gas prices have literally like doubled since 2020. Right. That's evident. That's not like a conjecture. That's not like a theory. That's there in your face. And I hope people like realize that America's not energy independent. America still is really dependent on foreign fuels, whether it be batteries or like different metals or oil. So that's the problem, is America relies on heavier crudes to come into mix with oil refineries like in Goshen, Oklahoma. And there's only like 180, 190 of these refineries around the world. And they're all like made to a specific blend. Like recently Sri Lanka took a shipment from Russia because that was the only place that was willing to give them oil. And they usually use Iranian crude. And now they got like Siberian crude, and that's not like they have to really adjust their things. So they have to put a whole oil refinery into downtime to switch it to refine different oils. So that's the problem. The oil market is very delicate and it's lacking 2 million barrels. So I think, and Putin's like PhD and everything is on energy economics. And I think that's why is Russia realizes it's an advantageous position for right now in energy, and it can cause an energy crisis. And that's how all societies stop functioning, because everything depends on energy, electricity, how we're talking right now, how we go get our food, how we get to our work. It's all energy. It's all fossil fuels. And that stuff is running lower and lower. It's not going to run out, but it's getting harder to get. Like you have to put in more barrels of energy to get like other barrels of energy. It's not like 1 to 100. It's like, 1 to 9 now. So once you have the end of cheap energy, you have the end of a good quality of life for most people. And that's what's happening in Europe. The cost of living crisis in England, the cost of living crisis here. This is all because energy is running thin, and the Russians know this, and they know they can put this pressure point on. They know the Germans got rid of their nuclear program, probably because a lot of people cope that nuclear solves everything. No, France's electricity is 30% more expensive than German ones because you still have to get refined uranium. You still have to service these expensive plants. You still have to build them. It takes like 20 to 25 years for a nuclear power plant to turn a profit. And guess who has a lot of control of the uranium? It's Russia. So Russia has control of all these necessary things. Yeah, it doesn't have a Twitter, it doesn't have a Facebook, it doesn't have all these like DoorDash or like Uber Eats. Yeah, it doesn't have these like fake things that don't exist in thin air that supposedly, America's such a big economy because it has like, trans dating apps and like food delivery for obese people. Like, yeah, okay, we have these things in thin air that supposedly are worth trillions of dollars. But when it comes to like real economy stuff, the West is weak in that. The West is weakening in that, and that's why I think that's why Russia's economy has been resilient. Even The Economist, which is an anti-Russian newspaper, or it's basically the biggest economist The Economist is the biggest economic kind of like journal for most people. Even admits that, hey, the Russian economy is really resilient. Look at the ruble. You say about it, all currencies are manipulated, but still, Biden said, what did Biden say about the ruble? He said it will be rubble, and that's not the case at all. It's like at a 6-year high, so that's the thing. Energy matters. This is what we're getting back to. We're sobering up. We're sobering up from the fake economy, from the stuff that's not necessary, because ad revenue or like clothes or like all these fancy gas, those are option, but people need to pay for gas. People need to pay for food. And now that this war happened, that's what's going to go up. That's where you're going to see inflation in. And that's why Russia took, I think, this move. It's a bold move. It's a risky move, but history's being made. The lines of Europe are changing again, and some people are spurging about that. They have their soy face. They don't like it. Go fight over there. If you're an ethnic Ukrainian in America, go fight over there. Go fight it, because your country's getting destroyed. Your country's getting invaded. What are you doing? You're sitting on Twitter. You're sitting on Discord. You're sitting on YouTube comments. Go fight over there. Don't bitch on here. Your country's getting invaded. Go fight it there if you really truly believe in there. If you're truly ethnic Ukrainian, go do it, because this is not gonna win the war for you. So that's the thing in the end, is that like we're kind of snapping back to reality after COVID and everything. Is that, hey, now there's a price at the pump to pay. There's finally, things are getting expensive. We're getting a slap in the face. We lived in decadence for so long, and now reality is going to hit many people. And this is going to, last time this happened was the Arab Spring, and we saw the collapse of Libya collapse, still in war, still a collapsed country. Syria, partial collapse. Iraq, you have Yemen completely collapsed, and these countries don't really recover. There's not like the support for these countries to recover. So that's the thing. And when we see Sri Lanka collapse, we see Pakistan. You have Khan running a whole like, I don't know if you saw it in Pakistan. It's insane. He has like a convoy of 200,000 people on the way to the capital to fight. He got ousted, and it's insane. You're gonna see the whole world really go on fire over this, because everything was supported with cheap energy and cheap food and all this, and that is no longer a guarantee.
A really good take. I never thought of it in those terms. Listen, man, I had you on for a little over 2 hours. I'd love to keep talking to you about this. Let's do it again. Maybe the situation is going to change in the near future, and we'll adjust fire as things progress.
Yeah.
Again, I get into a lot of arguments about the war in Ukraine. I am actually a really good armchair general. Just this in particular situation, I can't make heads or tails of it, and you've really clarified a lot of different things for me, which I really appreciate. That I want to definitely do a war in Syria with you, where we could revisit 2011, 2012. That's kind of like my bread and butter. Talking about our lying Assad and sloppy jihad.
Syria's a more fun one. Syria's a more fun one. A lot more factions in there. A lot more. The map changes a lot more. I mean, Syria. Oh yeah. That one's more like a fucking entertaining soccer match. It's not. It's devastating, but that was a crazy war to watch. I remember watching like the Mad Max in the desert stuff, the war machines that came out of that. Man, like, yeah, Syria. I definitely would like to do that with you. That would be awesome. And I think it's very important to go back to 2011, go back to 2012. What were the predictions back then? So we can learn who to trust, who to, because a lot of people have from both sides have had like wild predictions, and they've never come true. And it's like, who has consistency, who has credibility? We need to find out, because there's a lot of murkiness. So it's a really good idea to go back to the Syrian conflict. I would have to get all my screenshots and notes from 2015, 2014 back then together. But
I'm in the middle of writing an article.
People forgot about Syria, man. It's like
the Syrian War Revisited.
Yeah, the Syrian War Revisited. That would be cool. That's needed because now it's forgotten about, right? It's like, oh, whatever, like it doesn't exist anymore. You don't hear a blip about it. I think Assad just visited one of the Arab states on the coast, right? He with the first time since like the war began, right? So things are like looking up for his regime for the first time in a long time. So things change. Things can change so fast in this life. It's like I think Lenin said this, and it's there's decades where nothing happens, or years where nothing happens, and there's a year where decades happen, and I think the 2020s are going to be that, because look at the difference between 2010 and 2020 versus 2020 to 2022. I mean, it's insane the amount of changes. We're going to hyper speed now. It's hard to keep up with stuff at this point. You have a legitimate war between two industrial states on continent of Europe. Who thought they would see that again? You had like Francis Fukuyama, who said it's the end of history, and history's back. History's back, and a lot of people wanted to stay stagnant, and that's not going to happen. There's people who are willing to push and make the effort and to make history, and that's what's going to happen. So at least we're living in an era of history again.
Do you think Putin's a controlled opposition? Are we kind of like cheering for Russia, and in fact they're on board for a long-term goal of you alone, nothing can be happy?
There's some arguments I can see where that is the case.
It's a loaded question.
There's some arguments I can see that, like, yeah, we've been actually on like some Twitter space I've done. We've been trying to like go through this, like, well, like, what's Putin done with this invasion? Is he like a controlled? His favorite movies where like one Soviet guy goes and defeats the whole Nazi army by commanding it to its doom. We're kind of like watching Ukraine. It's hard to see, right? And that could be a possibility too, but. Here's the thing: is the West? The West is that is the woke capital is funding one side, is promoting one side, it's muting one side, and that's the enemy of the American people. That's the enemy of British people, German people, French people. Like, we need to return to a state of nationalism. Globalism has failed people all over the world, and right now this is really a globalist. When you look at the background I gave, like today, you see this like globalist versus nationalist kind of struggle in the world. So yeah, there's no good guy, bad guy here, but I think there's objectively there's a better side. There's a better guy, right? There's the devil, the less of the two devils, right? So yeah, but I'm open to, if things change, I'm open to changing my opinion as the data changes or things get revealed. But for now, I've watched, like you watched Syria, I watched the Donbass Wars for 8 years. Knowing the language, I can see the primary sources that, and then I can say, hey, the Western media was saying this is completely not true. So I can see who's more inconsistent, and but I think time is the ultimate judge. Time will tell, because in the end, it's not about who's really ethically right, unfortunately. It's about who wins battles, who wins wars, who takes land, who destroys the other army. That's really, everything, words and paper and arguments and rhetoric that gets puts to the wind. It's about who can beat the other guy to a bloody pulp before he gets beat. So that's the human way. That we're still that ape, So at the end, that's what matters.
I like to see how Finland, if Finland's really gonna go through with joining NATO. I think that might be my concern. Is if the West keeps supplying weapons to Ukraine and Russian soldiers wind up dying at the hands of arms supplied by the West, that's going to have a political backlash on Putin and his henchmen. And if he doesn't do something about Finland joining NATO, I think Putin might be in for like a bit of a rude awakening if this war of attrition does unfold in Ukraine. I don't think it's going to be a war of attrition. A lot of American military experts think that you have to win a war within the first month. You got to do it. No, that's the way you think in America, and that's what you've been programmed to think.
Yeah.
That's how combat wins. That's not necessarily the case. Wars can drag on for years on end and not necessarily be a war of attrition, air quote. Things, the battle lines move, right?
Yeah.
You have a push and pull, tug of war. It's just not this wham, bam, thank you, we're in and out, shock and awe.
Yep.
These things take time. It's methodical. We live in an age where, again, this instant gratification. You got to win now. War's got to be over right now.
Yeah, where are the gains? Where are the gains?
The
You know, why haven't you moved 30 kilometers today? Yeah, low attention spans, and yeah, again, it's about who can stand the test of times, perseverance, who can keep going. So it's more of a marathon, and that's probably what we'll see in this conflict with Finland and Sweden, and you know, it's causing like more strife in NATO because Turkey's like, you know, and Turkey's a much bigger partner than both those countries, and Turkey's kind of like, hey, no, you can't join. We have these grievances with the Kurdish forces you supported, and you're harboring your countries. You know, give them to us, arrest them all, give them to us. There's all these issues, and this NATO thing, you know. Just look at NATO's performance in Afghanistan. Look at NATO's performance in every war. What has it really achieved? It's failed in Afghanistan. NATO, it was like a mishmash of forces that didn't have integrated logistics. It's kind of like a mess. United armies like that, you know, the Axis forces, Romanians, Italians, Germans, they tried to integrate. They didn't succeed. And I don't think these multinational forces are really, they're really not going to like have that multiplication effect people think. They're not going to be as maneuverable. They're really overhyped, and a lot of people are forgetting the NATO failures in Afghanistan, which was an embarrassment. And so yeah. And when this NATO thing, when it's a NATO-Russian war, it just turns into, you know, nuclear immediately. So when Sweden and NATO join, you know, a guy in the Ural bunker, he just gets up out of his chair and puts 2 more thumbtacks on some cities, Finland and Sweden. So that's all that happens.
Listen, it's good chatting with you. Let's do this again. Don't flake on me, son of a bitch.
Yeah, we'll do. We'll see. We'll see what happens. This war, it may change. It may stagnate to nothing. And I think it's maybe once a month do like an update on it and see what our predictions were. And but what are your predictions, kind of, for this war?
Man, it beats the hell out of me. The last couple of weeks, I've kind of leaned. I mean, I'm agnostic. I mean, I'm a little bit more sympathetic towards Russia, especially because of the global homo and Putin acting a bit of a counterbalance towards, you know, this soft power. And mind you, Putin's had numerous. He's extended olive branches so many times the past 20 years and just got shitted on, whether it be the war with Chechnya, the war in Georgia, which you also discussed with me off air, which was fascinating. He's been diplomatic, and I think what happened in Kazakhstan, what was that? And I think January was the red line where he said, you know, fuck it, I'm going into Ukraine. There's nothing you can do about it. You go on.
Yeah, the West really needs this boogeyman of Putin to rally everyone behind. It's become like without Putin, the Ukrainian nationalism movement does not exist, because every religion needs its evil, right? And once Putin's not there, that's it. So that's the thing. But right now, Putin's a distraction from, because in the end, what's going to affect us is where we're living, our communities, where we're around, our families. And right now, we're looking at lower standards of living. We're looking for more strife here, and that's where the conflict's going to be. It's not going to be in a nation that's 6,000 miles away from you. It's going to be right in your own neighborhood with these, the lower standard of living that we're staring on. But Putin's a good distraction for that. He's like a Thanos Marvel supervillain that, like, you know, oh, this guy, what's he up to? What's he doing? Look how evil he is, you know. It's a cheap thrill on the part of us.
But I mean, as far as my prediction, I don't think Odessa at this point, unless there's like a mass mobilization of Russian forces. I think as soon as they've done with the Donbass, that's kind of where the war stagnates. But I may be wrong. This is just from what I'm seeing now. Kharkiv is not taken.
I also think Russia. I think Russia wants control of wheat and grain production.
Yeah, which they have right now
with energy,
because Ukraine can't really export. Ukraine, I guess they can export it through. This is the problem: is it's the fuel situation. If there's no fuels to fuel all these vehicles and everything, and to move your troops around, it's over. And we'll see. There is still Ukraine still can export wheat like it does through semi trucks. There's a lot of traffic jams right now through like its western neighbors. So. But the most cheapest and efficient route is the waters, and that's blockaded. So we're gonna see mass starvation, and that can lead to another refugee wave into Western Europe. And hey, are those systems so sustainable? Are those countries so rosy as they say, or are they gonna face energy crises and cost of living crises, which leave internal strife? Maybe the future isn't these major wars. It's all internal wars that are gonna happen.
Again, circling back to is Russia really down with you will own nothing, you be happy? Look, in the background, which we didn't even talk about, is China. I mean, what more would China want than Russia to go to war with Europe? China could come out of this, looking as being the world power after watching the West and the West and the western half of Russia being annihilated. China can be like what America was in 1946, so to speak. Yeah. You start colonizing and building up the whole world and pushing, social credits on all of us.
Yeah, there's a good documentary about that. It's called Trump's Biggest Failure. It's about like how what China was able to achieve in just 4 years, and it's kind of like really scary. So I think
it's kind of crazy. Just like COVID has caused so many knock-on effects, and the thing is, like, the timing of the invasion of Ukraine really helped, again, shift a lot of people's focus on, again, inflation, ongoing internal civil strife, whether it's like BLM or even like Roe versus Wade, whatever. We're in a constant state of revolution, perpetual revolution. So you saw it happen the past week where we can't catch a break. A 24-hour news cycle really is a 24-hour news cycle because it's something new every day thrown at us. Yeah. And I just found that the whole situation in Ukraine, the timing of that was a little bit odd because if, I'm, again, armchair in this, if I was if I was a 4-star general of the Russian military, I'd say, hey, listen, they were on lockdowns. They're all fighting over vaccines. Now's the time to just go right into Ukraine when everyone's kind of like in disarray, right? So they invaded Ukraine when when the COVID narrative was kind of on the wane. So we went from COVID straight to Ukraine. Now we're back to internal politics, whether again this is Roe versus Wade or these mass shooting events. And the invasion of Ukraine, in a sense, was also a way of clouding a lot of the mismanagement by the Fed, whether it's orchestrated or not. Obviously, I would choose the fact that it is all orchestrated, obviously. But it just, like I said, there's so many moving pieces to this in comparison to like the war in Syria, where you kind of got a good grasp on it for people such as ourselves. But you've kind of laid out Ukraine in a very logical manner, which again helps me out a lot to understand it better.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. I think it's very productive. Yeah. So, and then we'll visit. In a month or so, we'll visit this back, and we'll visit the Syrian war, maybe other wars, Georgian war, Chechnyan war, maybe Iraq war. What's happening after that? Because that's the thing. The spotlight's gone, and no one paid attention to it, and it's like these countries just disappear into the nether, and it's you find interesting things if you go dig it up again. You get surprised. You get surprised at what you find.
Well, that's why I have you on first, as always. I'm going to get in touch with Expat Aftermath We'll do a three-way chat because I'm sure
Yeah.
he has a lot of good points about the situation in Ukraine. Let's keep in touch. We'll do it again. Thanks so much, man.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Cheers.